She sent me a voice message just before midnight. She said she hadn't been able to go near the canal since it happened. And then she told me about her mother. This story came from a woman in a village in the Mekong Delta. She asked me not to use her real name. I've called her Lin. Everything else, the letters, the flood, the name she said into the water, is exactly as she described it to me. The bus dropped her at the edge of the main road, and from there, she walked. Lin had forgotten how flat the delta was. In Ho Chi Minh City, the eye is always catching on something. A building, a sign, a motorbike cutting across the lane. Here, the land just continues. Rice paddies in every direction, pale green under the late afternoon sky, broken only by the thin raised paths between fields and the dark line of coconut palms along the canal. Everything was exactly the size it was. Nothing was competing with anything else. She had left this village when she was 22. She was 34 now. She had not planned to come back, not like this. With one bag and a phone message from her aunt that said simply, "Your mother has stopped talking. You need to come." The house looked smaller than she remembered, which was always the way. The walls were still that faded yellow, the color of old bone. The bougainvillea her mother had planted along the front fence had grown wild and taken over one side of the gate. Lin had to push through it to get to the door, and the branches scratched her arm, and she did not stop to look at the mark they left. Her mother was at the window. She was sitting in the same wooden chair she had always kept there, facing out toward the paddies, her hands folded in her lap. She did not turn when Lin came in. She did not speak. Lin stood in the doorway for a moment, her bag still on her shoulder, and watched her mother's back and the stillness of it, and felt something shift inside her that she did not have a word for yet. "Ma," she said. Her mother's head moved slightly, not a turn, more like an acknowledgement, the smallest possible motion that still counted as one. But she kept her eyes on the fields. Her aunt came by that evening with rice and a pot of soup, and the particular kind of cheerfulness people use when they are covering something difficult. She set the food on the table. She talked about the weather and the price of vegetables, and she refilled Lin's cup twice without being asked. Lin waited until there was a pause. How long has she been like this? Her aunt looked at the soup. 3 months, more or less. 3 months, and no one called me. She wasn't this bad at first. She was talking a little. Then she just... Her aunt moved her hand in a vague gesture, the kind that means stopped without wanting to say it directly. "The doctor says there's nothing physically wrong. He says sometimes people just go quiet for a while. Did something happen 3 months ago?" Her aunt picked up her cup. "The village had a difficult time. There was a woman, Bà Tám. You probably don't remember her. She was already old when you were a child. She went missing, out into the paddies one evening, and never came back." Lin waited. They found her sandals at the edge of the field, the canal side, nothing else. Her aunt took a sip of tea. "Old woman. It was a sad thing. People looked for a few days." "A few days," Lin said. "The fields are very deep in some places. After a while..." Her aunt set the cup down and looked at the wall. "After a while you stop." That night, Lin lay on the narrow bed in her childhood room and listened to the delta. It had its own particular sound, frogs always, and the distant murmur of water moving somewhere in the canal network, and occasionally a motorbike far away on the main road. She had spent 12 years sleeping above the noise of a city, and she had thought, going to sleep, that the quiet here would feel like rest. It didn't. The quiet here felt like attention, like something listening as carefully as she was. In the morning, her mother was at the window again. Before Lynn had finished making coffee, she sat in the same position, hands in her lap, eyes toward the paddies. The light at that hour came in at a low angle across the fields and turned the water between the rice shoots a pale orange. It was, objectively, a beautiful thing to look at, but her mother's face did not look like a person watching something beautiful. It looked like a person watching for something that was not yet there. Lynn brought her a cup of tea and set it on the sill beside her. Her mother did not touch it, but one finger moved, just one, lifting slightly from her folded hands and then settling back. And Lynn did not know what it meant, but felt sure it meant something. She spent the afternoon walking the village paths, the way she used to as a child, nodding to the people who recognized her. Most of them did. This was the kind of village where you were remembered whether you wanted to be or not. She asked carefully about Bà Tám, and what she found was this. No one could quite say when they had first known the woman. She had simply always been there, at the edge of things, in the way that certain people in small places become part of the landscape without anyone noticing when it happened. An old woman who lived alone near the field's far edge, who kept to herself, who had no family that anyone could name, who walked into the paddies at dusk, some said, who stood there very still, facing the water. Lynn asked one of the older women, a neighbor who had known her mother for 50 years, whether her mother had been close to Bà Tám. The woman looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked away, toward the fields. In the same direction everyone in this village seemed to look when they did not want to answer a question. Your mother, she said slowly, stopped speaking the same morning we found the sandals. She said nothing else. She went inside and closed her door, and the sound of it closing was very soft, and somehow that made it feel more final than if she had slammed it. Lynn stood on the path in the thick afternoon heat and looked toward the paddies. The rice moved in a small wind. The water between the rows was still and flat, and gave back only the white of the sky. She had come home to find her mother. She was beginning to understand that her mother's silence was not about absence. It was about something that was still here. The second morning, Lynn woke before her mother did. She made coffee in the small kitchen, watching the sky through the window above the sink change from black to a flat, pale gray. The paddies were invisible in the early dark, just a wide, empty feeling beyond the fence, a sense of distance rather than a thing you could see. By the time the light came up enough to make out the rice rows, her mother was already in the chair. Lynn had not heard her move. She had not heard the bedroom door, or the shuffle of slippers on the tile floor, or the creak of the chair that she remembered from childhood as being loud enough to wake the whole house. Her mother had simply appeared at the window the way a person appears in a dream. Completely, without transition, she set a cup of tea on the sill and went to sit at the kitchen table with her own coffee and her phone, and the small pile of questions she had been arranging and rearranging in her mind since the night before. She did not know yet how to ask them. She was not sure her mother would answer even if she did. She spent the morning going door to door, not officially. She had no authority here, No reason anyone was obliged to speak to her, but she was Min's daughter, and that meant something in a village this size, and she used it carefully, the way you use something you know has limits. The older women were the hardest to read. They spoke to her politely, offered her water or tea or a piece of fruit, and answered her questions about Bà Tám with the particular skill of people who have spent their whole lives saying things that sound like answers without actually being them. Yes, they knew her. Of course they knew her. She had lived at the far end of the village for as long as anyone could remember. Quiet woman, kept to herself. No family, or none that ever visited. It was sad, what happened. Very sad. And then the pause that followed each very sad, which was the pause of people who did not think it was entirely sad, or who thought it was sad in a more complicated way than they were prepared to explain to someone who had been away for 12 years. It was an old man, Ong Hai, who had worked the paddies his whole life and now sat most mornings under the tarp outside his house, mending nets he would probably never use again, who told her the most useful thing. He did not seem to weigh his words the same way the women did. He simply said what he knew. She walked out at dusk, he said, not looking up from the net. Every evening, same time, same direction. The path along the canal side, out to the far field. She'd stand there for a while, just standing, and then come back. How long had she done that? Lin asked. He pulled a knot tight. Long as I knew her, 40 years, maybe more. We stopped noticing after a while. It was just what she did. Did she ever say why? He looked up at Lin, then, just briefly, with the expression of a man who has thought about a question for a long time and still does not have an answer that satisfies him. She said she was listening, he said. I asked her once, years ago, and that's what she said. Listening. He went back to the net. I didn't ask again. That evening, Lin sat on the front step after dinner and watched the light go out of the sky. The dusk in the delta happened slowly. The orange bled into pink, then into a deep flat gray, then into a dark that wasn't fully dark because the water in the paddies held onto the last of the light longer than the land did. The rice rows became black lines. The water between them became pale silver. And then that too faded, and there was just the sound of frogs and the occasional movement of something in the canal. That was when she heard it, low and rhythmic, coming from the direction of the far field. Not loud. She would have missed it if the frogs had been louder, or if she had been inside. It was a sound like humming, but slower than humming, more like the way a person breathes when they are very close to sleep. It rose and fell. It had no melody she could identify. It was simply a sound that was there when it had not been there a moment before, coming from a direction where, as far as she knew, no one was. She stood up. She looked toward the far field. The dark out there was complete. No lamp, no phone screen, nothing. Just the sound, moving gently in and out like something breathing through the night. She stayed on the step for a long time, not going in and not going toward it. Then the frogs got louder again, and the sound was gone, or hidden inside the other sounds, and she could not be sure anymore whether she was still hearing it or only remembering it. She went inside. Her mother was still at the window, though it was full dark now and there was nothing to see. Her lips were moving. Lin crossed the room and crouched beside the chair and looked at her mother's face, close, trying to read the shape of the words. But there was no sound, only the movement small and continuous, the way a person moves their lips when they are saying something over and over to themselves, something they have said so many times, it no longer needs a voice. "Ma," Lin said softly. "What are you saying?" Her mother did not answer, but her eyes moved, just slightly, just enough, toward the dark window, and then back to her hands. She found the bundle the next morning while looking for an extra blanket in her mother's room. It was in the bottom of the old wardrobe, behind a folded pile of clothes that had not been moved in a long time. She could tell by the way the fabric had settled into the shape of the shelf, taking on the impression of the wood. The bundle was tied with a length of red string, the kind used for offering bundles at the temple, and the paper inside had been folded into the small, precise shapes that Lin recognized from childhood. Mourning shapes, the kind of folding women did when they meant to burn something as an offering, but were waiting for the right time. She counted them without unfolding any. Dozens, all the same size, all the same fold. She should have put them back. She knew that. These were her mother's things, in her mother's room, and 12 years away did not give her the right to open what was closed. But the red string had already come loose. She had not pulled it. It had simply given way when she lifted the bundle, as if it had been waiting for someone to pick it up. And the top sheet had unfolded slightly at the corner, and she could see handwriting inside. Small, careful, slanting to the left. She did not recognize the handwriting, but she recognized, even from that small corner of one unfolded sheet, that whoever had written these letters had written them with great care, the kind of care a person uses when they are writing to someone they are afraid will not receive the letter. She set the bundle on the bed. She sat down beside it. Outside, the paddies were bright in the morning light, and the water between the rice rows caught the sun and held it. And from where she sat, she could not tell the difference between the light coming down from the sky and the light rising up from the field below. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before she opened the first one. The bundle held 43 letters. She counted them twice, carefully, setting each folded sheet beside her on the bedspread in a row. They were all the same size, palm-sized, folded into 4, and all the same paper, the thin kind sold at the temple market for write-in prayers and offerings. The red string that had held them was in 2 pieces now, lying on the floor where it had fallen. She left it there. The handwriting inside each letter was the same, small, careful, and slightly uneven. The way handwriting gets when the person holding the pen is old but still deliberate. Most of the letters were addressed to a name Lin did not recognize, a child's name, Beilan, written at the top of each page in the same careful way a teacher writes a name on an exercise book. Inside, the words were simple: how the weather had been, how the rice had come in, what the canal looked like in the dry season when the water went low and you could see the mud below. Small things, the kind of things a person writes when they want the other person to feel present, to feel that they have not missed anything important by being away. Lin read 6 of them before she understood what she was holding. These were not letters that had ever been sent. They had never been folded for a postbox or handed to anyone. They had been folded the way you fold things for burning, for sending by fire, the way offerings are sent, and then never burned, kept instead. 43 letters to a child named Beilan, written across what looked like many years, never sent and never burned. held together with red string in the bottom of a wardrobe that was not Bà Tám's, which meant her mother had kept them. Her mother had been given them, or had taken them, or had found them, and had kept them for a reason she had chosen not to share. Linh set down the letter in her hand and looked at the row of folded pages on the bedspread. Then she picked up the last one, the one at the end of the row, which she had set aside without opening, because even before she touched it, she could see it was different. Newer paper, the fold slightly less certain, as though the hands that made it had been shaking. The morning of the 14th sister. I am writing this to you because I cannot say it to your face, and you know why. I have waited long enough. 40 years is long enough. The rituals have not worked because I have been doing them wrong, and I think you have known that for longer than you have told me. I am going tonight to call her back the right way. I do not know if it will bring her home or only bring me to her. Either way, I am tired of standing at the edge and listening to a sound that never gets closer. I'm going in. Forgive me if this was the wrong thing. I think it was the only thing. I am going to bring her back. Linh read the letter twice. Then she set it face down on the bedspread and pressed her palm flat against the paper, the way her mother used to press a cloth against a wound. Not hard, just present, just covering it. Through the open doorway, she could hear the small sounds of the house, the tick of the clock in the front room, the slow turning of the ceiling fan, and beyond that, through the front window, the paddies in the midday heat, shimmering slightly, perfectly still. She went that evening. She told herself she was going to look at the place where the sandals had been found, nothing more. She told herself she was being practical, gathering information, understanding the geography. She walked the canal path with her phone in her hand and the torch app on, though the light was not completely gone yet when she set out. The sky in the west was still a deep orange above the tree line, and the paddies on either side of the path held that color in the water between the rows, so that walking between them felt like walking through something lit from below. The far field was where Ong Hai had described, past the bend in the canal, where the path widened slightly and then ended at a flat bank of hard earth at the water's edge. She could see where other feet had stood before her. The soil was packed down in a particular way, a small smoothed area the size of a person's standing space. 40 years of evenings, she thought. 40 years of standing in this exact place. Listening, she turned off the torch and stood in the dusk and listened herself. The frogs were starting up, distant and uneven. The water in the canal moved very slowly to her left, carrying a few dead leaves and the reflection of the last skylight. The rice on either side was dark now, just shapes against the dimming blue. A motorbike passed somewhere far away on the main road, and then the sound dissolved, and there was only the frogs again, and the water, and her own breathing. And then she looked down. The canal beside the bank was shallow here, no more than knee-deep, and the water was very still at the edge, where there was no current. In that stillness, the surface acted like a mirror. She could see herself in it, standing on the bank, her shape dark and slightly distorted by the minute texture of the water. She looked at her own reflection for a moment. The reflection looked back, and then, slowly, it changed. Not all at once. The shape of it shifted the way a face shifts when the light changes. The same elements rearranging themselves into something different. The reflection in the water was no longer hers. It was smaller, rounder in the face. The hair was shorter and cut straight across the forehead, the way mothers used to cut children's hair when there was no money for a barber. The eyes were open and very still, and looking up at her from below the surface of the water with the kind of patience that is not peace, but has lasted so long it has learned to look like peace. Lin did not move. She did not step back from the edge. She could not have said why. It was not bravery. It was something closer to the feeling of recognizing something you have always known without knowing you knew it. The face in the water was not a face she had ever seen in life, but she had seen it once in a faded photograph on her mother's dresser that had been there since before Lin could read. A photograph she had looked at many times as a child without ever being told who was in it or why it was kept. A small girl, maybe 4 years old, standing at the edge of a field, looking at the camera the way children look at cameras when they have been told to stand still. Slightly uncertain, slightly serious, not yet understanding that this is the moment being kept. The water shifted. A small current moved through from the canal and broke the surface, and the reflection scattered into rings and was gone. Lin stood at the bank and watched the rings expand and flatten and disappear, and the water returned to its mirror smoothness, and this time it showed only the sky and her own dark shape and nothing else. She stayed until it was fully dark. Then she turned and walked back along the canal path, her torch on, the beam catching the edges of the rice and the flat black surface of the water on her left. She did not run. She walked carefully and steadily, the way a person walks when they are holding something fragile inside them that they do not want to spill. She knew the face. She did not yet know the name, but she knew, with the same quiet certainty she had felt standing at the bank, that her mother did, that her mother had always known, and that the silence of the past 3 months was not the silence of a woman who had lost something. It was the silence of a woman who finally understood what needed to be done and was waiting to see if anyone else would understand it too. Her mother spoke that night. Lin had not told her about the field. She had come home in the dark, washed her hands and face at the kitchen sink, and sat at the table without eating. She had placed the bundle of letters in front of her and left them there, still folded, still stacked, still held loosely together now that the red string was gone. She had not decided what to do with them or what to say. She was still deciding when the front room went quiet in a different way, the kind of quiet that happens when something changes, not when nothing does. She looked up. Her mother had turned from the window. It was the first time in the 3 days since Lin had arrived that her mother had sat facing into the room rather than out of it. She looked smaller this way, without the paddies behind her to give the window its framing. Just a small woman in a wooden chair, her hands in her lap, her eyes on the bundle of letters on the table. Her face was very still, not the blankness of the past 3 months. This was a different kind of stillness. The stillness of a person who has made a decision and is now waiting to say it out loud. "You found them," her mother said. Her voice was low and slightly rough, the way voices get when they have not been used in a long time. But it was her voice, fully, completely, and the sound of it moved through Lin like something warm and immediate, the way heat moves through cold hands, arriving in places she had not known were cold. "Yes," Lin said. She kept her voice level. She was afraid that if she showed too much relief or urgency or the particular sharp feeling of 3 days of worry, suddenly having somewhere to go, her mother would stop, would fold back into silence the way water folds back after you lift your hand from it. So she sat still and said only yes and waited. Her mother looked at the letters for a long moment. Then she began. It was the year of the big flood. Lin would have been 2 years old, too young to remember, and her mother had never spoken of it directly. Only around it, the way she spoke around several things from that era, with the careful avoidance of someone navigating a space where the floor is not entirely trustworthy. The floods in the Delta came every year, as they always had, and the village knew how to read them. They knew the signs of a bad year, the sky color in August, the behavior of the water birds, the level of the canal in the weeks before the rains peaked. But that year, the water had come faster than anyone read it, and from a direction no one had prepared for. And in a single night, the paddies on the eastern side of the village had gone from shin-deep to waist-deep to something a person could drown in. Most families got out. The village had drills for this, informal ones, passed from parent to child across generations. You take the children first, then the elderly, then the animals, then the rice, if there is time, and there is never time. People moved fast and mostly together, and mostly everyone arrived at the raised ground on the western road by midnight. Bà Tám's daughter did not. She was 4 years old. Her name was Lan, just Lan. Not a formal name, a milk name, the kind of name you give a child in the early years before you give them the name that will follow them into school and work and the world. She had been asleep when the water came, in the room at the back of the house, and by the time Bà Tám reached her, the water was already at the doorframe. She got the child as far as the path. The path was gone. The water took the child in the dark, in the chaos of a night when everyone was trying to find higher ground and not everyone was watching every direction at once. They found her the next morning at the far field where the water had carried her. She was in the rice, not in the canal. Very still, very small. The flood had receded enough by then that you could see the rows again, and she was lying between two of them as though she had simply lain down there to rest. Her mother stopped speaking for a moment. She looked at her hands. Then she continued. The burial had been fast. The village had other dead that week, and the living required more immediate attention. And there was a collective, unspoken guilt that settled over the community in the days after the flood. Not guilt for any single person's choice, but the vaguer, harder kind. The guilt of a group of people who had all done what they thought was right and had not managed, collectively, to save a child. That guilt made the village want to move forward, to plant the next crop, to rebuild what the water had taken, to stop looking back at the field where the small girl had been found, and get on with the work of living. Bà Tám did not stop looking, but she was alone in her grief, and the village was busy with its own recovery. And somewhere in the years that followed, a terrible and ordinary thing happened. The burial site was not properly marked. The mound at the field's edge weathered and was plowed over, and eventually was indistinguishable from the earth around it. And because the child had only a milk name, a name that belonged to the private world of mother and infant, not to any official record or temple register, the monks who came to conduct prayers did not know what name to use. Bà Tám told them, but the name she gave was not the right one. She told them the name she used at home. Lin's mother said quietly, Bé Lan, little Lan. It was what she always called her. She looked at the letters. But a milk name is not a true name. The prayers went out into the air and found nothing to attach to. The offerings burned, and the smoke carried the wrong address, and the child's spirit stayed where it was. She pressed her lips together. 40 years of prayers, 40 years of offerings, all to the wrong name. The room was very quiet. The ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. Outside, the frogs had started their nightly sound in the paddies, and beneath them, the lower sound of the water in the canal, which was always there once you stopped talking long enough to hear it. "What is the right name?" Lin asked. Her mother looked at her for a long time. Her eyes were dry. She had done her crying for this story a long time ago, in private, the way the women of this place did most of their crying. "Thi Hoa," she said. Her birth name was Thi Hoa. I was there when she was born. I was the one who wrote it down. Her voice dropped, and I never told Tam. Not when it might have helped her. I thought it was too late, that enough time had passed, that the child had found her way regardless. She looked toward the dark window. I was wrong about that. Lin sat with that for a while. The name sat between them on the table, like something solid. Thi Hoa, 2 syllables, flower. The kind of name that meant something hopeful and ordinary, and was given by parents who did not know yet what the years would do. "Bà Tám's letter," Lin said. She said she was going in the right way this time, that she had figured out what was wrong. Her mother nodded slowly. "She came to me 2 weeks before she went. She had worked it out. Not the name. She never knew the name. But she had understood that the direction was wrong. The ritual was wrong. That she had been calling from the wrong place on the bank. She was going to try again from the place where the child was found." Her mother's hands tightened slightly in her lap. I should have told her then. The name. I should have told her, and I didn't. She stopped. She looked down. "She went anyway," she said. "Without the name. And whatever she found out there, whether she reached the child or the child reached her, she didn't come back. And I have been sitting here since then, trying to decide if her silence out there and my silence in here are the same kind of thing." Lin looked at her mother's face, at the 3 months of stillness in it, and underneath that, the 40 years of something she had held and not given and been wrong about. The face of a woman who had made one quiet error and watched it compound across a lifetime. "Ma," she said gently, "tell me where the child was found." Exactly where. Her mother told her, and then she said, quietly, plainly, as if she had been waiting to say it since before Lin arrived. "You'll need to go at dusk. That's when the water is most still. That's when she can hear you clearly." She turned back to the window. The paddies outside were completely dark now, invisible, present only as a feeling. The wide open feeling of flat land and standing water, and a sky with more stars than the city ever showed. Her mother's face in the window glass was a pale reflection of itself, looking out and looking in at the same time, watching the dark the way she had watched it every morning and every evening for 3 months, waiting, Lin understood now, for someone to go and do what she no longer had the strength to do herself, waiting for her daughter to come home so that she could send her back out again. She waited until the sky began to change color. That was what her mother had told her. Go at dusk, when the light is leaving but has not fully left, when the water is at its most still, and the air between the living world and whatever sits beside it is at its thinnest. Lin had lived 12 years in a city where dusk meant nothing except the switching on of lights and the increase of traffic noise. She had forgotten that dusk could mean something else, that it could be a time of day with a particular quality, a particular kind of attention to it, the way certain hours in certain places carry weight that others don't. She prepared carefully, not with ceremony. She had no training in ritual, no knowledge of the precise forms, and her mother had told her not to try. The right words are simpler than the monks make them, her mother had said, before turning back to the window in the particular way that meant the conversation was complete. You only need to know her name and mean it. She found a small oil lamp in the back of the kitchen cupboard, the old kind with a wick and a glass chimney, the kind her mother had kept for power cuts. She filled it and lit it and held it carefully in one hand. In her jacket pocket, she placed a small cloth pouch of uncooked rice, an offering, plain and honest, the most basic thing this land had to give. She put the letters in her other pocket, all 43 of them, still folded, plus the last one. She did not know if she would need them, or would burn them, or would simply carry them there and back again. She took them because they belonged to the field as much as they belonged anywhere, and because Bà Tám had written them facing in this direction for 40 years, and it felt wrong to leave them behind now. She told her mother she was going. Her mother did not turn from the window, but one hand rose slightly from her lap, just a small lift, a partial gesture, the way you raise a hand to say, I know, when you cannot say it with your voice. And then settled back. Lin took that with her too. The canal path at dusk was a different thing from the canal path in daylight. The same narrow raised earth between the water and the rice. The same coconut palms at intervals. The same frogs beginning their nightly startup at the edges of the paddies. But the light did something to it. The low orange of the setting sun, coming in flat across the fields, catching the surface of every stretch of standing water and turning it briefly, intensely bright, so that the paddies on either side of her were lit from within, glowing. The rice rose dark lines against the burning water. She walked slowly. She did not want to arrive before the light had done what it needed to do. The far field was exactly where her mother had described, past the bend in the canal, where the path widened and ended at the flat earth bank. She had stood here the evening before, in the dark, and seen the face in the water. Now she stood here in the last of the light, the lamp already lit in her hand, though it was not yet dark enough to need it, and she looked at the water and saw only the sky reflected back, orange fading to pink, fading at the edges to a pale grey blue. She set the lamp down on the bank. She reached into her pocket and took out the pouch of rice and opened it and held it in her open palm. Then she stood very still and let the dusk settle around her and thought about what her mother had said. You only need to know her name and mean it. She did not shout. She did not perform. She spoke the way you speak to someone who is close but cannot see you, clearly, at a normal volume, with the particular directness of a person who has something true to say and has decided to say it. Thi Hoa, she said. The name sat in the air above the water. The frogs went quiet for a moment. Not all of them, just the nearest ones, as though something had passed through the air and disturbed the sound around it. Then they started again. Thi Hoa, she said again. I know your name, your true name, not the milk name, not the one the offerings were sent to, your real name. The one your mother gave you before she gave you the other one." She paused. The water was very still. "I'm saying it now so you can hear it, so you know where to go." The light was going faster now. The orange had left the water, and the sky was deepening toward the dark blue that came just before full night. The lamp at her feet had become the brightest point in her visible world, a small, steady flame, barely moving, throwing a circle of warm yellow onto the earth and the edge of the water beside it. She opened her hand and let the rice fall. It scattered across the surface of the water in a thin spread, each grain catching the lamplight for a moment before it settled. She watched it float. She watched the rings from each landing grain spread and cross and flatten and disappear. And when the water was still again, she looked into it and said the name one more time. "Go home, Tihoa." And then, because she was her mother's daughter and had grown up in a place where the distance between the practical and the sacred was never very large, she added what felt like the most honest thing she could offer. "Your mother has been looking for you for 40 years. She went in after you. She's there somewhere too, looking. Go find her. Both of you go home." The humming started almost immediately. Low and rhythmic, the same sound she had heard from the front step 2 nights ago, rising and falling, coming from the direction of the far water. But it was different this time. Before, it had felt like something ongoing, something that had been happening for a long time and would continue. Now, it felt like something reaching its end, like a sound winding down through its last measures, not stopping abruptly, but easing, the way a top eases to stillness when it finally runs out of spin. She stood and listened to it slow. It took a long time, longer than she expected. The night came fully in around her, the stars appearing above the field in the particular dense scatter that is only visible far from city light, the canal becoming an invisible sound rather than a visible thing, the rice on either side of the bank losing its shape to the dark and becoming just a feeling of presence, of growing things standing in water, patient, indifferent, doing what they had always done. She stood in the middle of all of it with the lamp at her feet and her hands loose at her sides, and she listened to the humming wind slowly, slowly down. When it stopped, the quiet it left behind was not the quiet she had felt since arriving in the village. That quiet had been watchful, heavy with something unresolved, the way a room feels when an argument has just finished and no one has said the last word yet. This quiet was different. It was the quiet of a question that had received its answer, of a space that had held something for a long time and had finally been allowed to let it go. She stood in it for a while. Then she picked up the lamp and walked home. Her mother was asleep in the chair. Not the vigil stillness of the past 3 months, that careful, upright watchfulness that was not quite sleep and not quite waking. She was properly asleep, her head tilted to one side, her hands open in her lap, her face carrying the particular looseness of a person whose body has decided, at last, that it is safe to rest. The window beside her was dark. She was not facing the paddies. She was simply asleep in a chair, the way any old woman falls asleep in a chair at the end of a long day. And there was nothing in her face that looked like waiting. Lynn set the lamp on the kitchen table and stood in the doorway and watched her mother breathe. Then she looked at the table. The bundle of letters was still there, where she had left it that morning. 43 folded pages, plus the last one, stacked in a loose pile without the red string. But they had changed. When she had left, they had been folded tight, each one a small, precise rectangle, the edges sharp with intention. Now they were open, every one of them, flat and spread across the table, as though they had been read and set down one by someone who had finished reading and had no more use for the envelope. The handwriting was still visible on each page. Bà Tám's small, careful words filling the thin paper. But the quality of them had changed in the way that writing changes when the purpose behind it has been completed. They looked like letters that had arrived finally at the person they were meant for. Not messages waiting to be sent, messages received. Lin pulled a chair from the table and sat down among the open pages. She did not fold them. Her mother had said she was wrong to wait, and she had been. There was no longer any reason to keep these things closed. She sat at the table with the letters spread around her and the lamp burning low between them, and the sound of her mother breathing steadily in the next room. And she felt the particular tiredness that comes not from effort, but from something ending, the tiredness of attention that has finally released, moving back through the body as it goes, touching every place it had been held, without you knowing it was held there. Outside, the paddies were dark and quiet. The frogs were still. The canal moved at its own slow pace, in the direction it had always moved, carrying whatever the water carried. Leaves, light, the ordinary debris of living things, toward the wider river and then the sea. The rice stood in its rows in the dark, and the water stood between the rows, and the sky above held more stars than the city had ever let her see. In the morning, the village would wake, and the paddies would turn green again in the early light, and Lina's mother would be there, sleeping still or awake, or perhaps at the window again, but differently now, without the weight of the watch behind it. People would plant and harvest, and the canal would rise and fall with the seasons as it always had. Children would grow up in this place without knowing exactly what had been held in the fields at its edge for 40 years, or what had been released. That was all right. Not everything needed to be known to be true. Lin reached out and straightened the nearest letter, gently, not folding it, just smoothing the crease where the paper had been held shut too long. Then she left it open on the table and went to check on her mother, and the lamp burned quietly between the pages, and the night outside was the most ordinary and the most complete thing she had seen in years. If this story stayed with you, I think it was meant to. New stories from across Asia, every week, right here. I'm Haunted East. Subscribe if you want to keep listening.